So let me start by introducing Mr. Van Ark. Some of you may know him, some of you may have actually heard of him. Every time that I talk productivity with somebody and I mention, and by the way, I'm working with Bart Van Ark as well. Oh, Bart Van Ark, yeah, this is the authority on productivity. And indeed, Bart is an authority and has been an authority on productivity for many years. Bart spent 12 years at the Conference Board from 2008 to 2020 through 2020 as the chief economist and head of the Economies, Strategy and Finance Center based in the US. He's now back. He's living in the UK. He's professor of productivity studies, which sort of gives away his expertise at the Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester. He's also managing director and principal investigator of the Productivity Institute, a UK-wide organization which aims to lay the foundations for an era of sustained and inclusive productivity growth by bringing together academic research, policy studies, and business engagement. And of course, the business engagement is what we are doing today. He is a senior fellow, a senior advisor for us at the Conference Board. So he continues to work very closely with us. We're doing a project with Bart as well. So he is one of us still, even though he has left as a chief economist now 4 years ago, right, Bart? So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Bart. And thank you for joining us and taking the time and effort to deliver the message to our audience, Bart. To you.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. I think it's probably only good morning for most, but if not, afternoon for those who are more to the east of us. And thanks for that introduction. It's always great to do conference board events. It always feels like coming home a little bit. So I feel very comfortable in these kind of sessions, and I really appreciate to be invited again. I thought your reference to the Draghi report that was produced yesterday on the competitiveness of the European economy was quite apt. And it kind of betrays perhaps a little bit that I've been in this field for too long, because when I haven't read the 400 pages, but I've read sort of the press coverage, and I thought, I've seen a lot of this before. And is this really going to change the needle significantly in the right direction? Europe has had a productivity problem, and that includes the UK, by the way, where I am at the moment. A productivity problem for quite a while, and there have been really good reports about this on how government can help improve this. But I think, as you said, productivity, I always say productivity is done by business. It's not primarily done by government. Government can help. Government sometimes stands in the way as well. So there's definitely a role for government. But I think the more interesting question is how it can be that we are having all these opportunities around us, including all this technology and innovation opportunities that I will talk about today. And we don't really see that reflected in productivity growth. It raises a lot of questions around, are we measuring this well? Are we tackling this properly? Do we really understand what productivity is about? So I think even before I'm going to show you the agenda, I have 3 poll questions today. I start with one, there's one in the middle and one towards the end, and Derek has kindly agreed to put them up. And the first poll question, which I need to share my screen, I now realize, which I haven't done yet, which I'm going to do right now. Apologies for that.
No, it was actually nice seeing you, Bart. No worries.
You can see the screen now, right? Just to make sure. Good.
Yeah.
So the first poll question that I really wanted to put up of the 3 that I will have is, what do you associate productivity most with? And you can give it from least important, which is 1 to 5. That's most important. Is it the performance of the economy, which is what the Draghi report is around? Is it the performance of your own organization? Is it the performance of the people in your organization? Is it your own performance? Or is it even perhaps your daily personal productivity when you wake up in the morning until you go to bed at night? If you just choose from 1 to 5, 1 least important, 5 most important, we get a little bit of a feel from how you are thinking about productivity in first instance, because there are different lenses on this. And I think everyone should be able to see it now. And I see results coming in. Suppose I need to understand the color scheme. Derek, can you help us out? What is 1 and what is 5?
That is an excellent question. I would go for blue for one.
Blue for one. So if you turn from left to right, it's probably from most to least, right?
Let me check on that for you. I'll get back to you in a sec.
But let's assume the most logical and indeed is the blue part.
Is least. I don't know. I'm going to wait for Derek to come up with this because that will be quite important for assessing the poll here.
This is interesting. I've never seen it like this. Okay, anyway, why don't you go on?
Derek, unless you don't have the answer right away, we may come back to it and we'll save it.
I'll ping it to you in the chat.
Yeah, okay. We'll save it and we'll share it with you later. I think what we do see, however, here is that it's quite varied. Whatever you answer, not everyone is thinking about, some people will think it's about the economy in first instance. Some people think it's much more about my team and my organization. So the results are as I would have expected, which is that are quite varied in terms of what you're going to get. And I think that is a bit of the challenge when we talk through productivity. And therefore, my agenda this morning is a little bit set up from that we have to look at productivity perhaps from different lenses in the economy. So I'll start to talk a little bit about why is it actually important and what does it exactly mean, productivity? Because, as I said, there are different lenses to this. Then I will talk a little bit about what the Draghi report is about, which is why is actually a slowdown? I mean, why do we see in the macroeconomic numbers a slowdown? And then I will turn to business and say, but what does that have to do with us? What does that have to do with the business community? And what are actually the key drivers of productivity within a business organization? And then, of course, we will find that one of the key drivers, of course, is technology and digital. I already mentioned that, the rise of artificial intelligence. So I will spend a bit of time on how digital and artificial intelligence can help and why, again, we are not yet seeing the effects in the macroeconomic numbers, even though many of you will be experiencing the effects of these new technologies on a day-by-day basis. And then finally, of course, we'll really bring it down to the level of you as business executives on how can you make it happen as a business leader. So let's start about why does productivity matter and what does it exactly mean? And I think it's very important to realize that, as economists, as policymakers, but also as business leaders, we sometimes automatically assume that productivity is great. But frankly, when we ask people, even in the business community, but certainly outside the business community, what they think about productivity, it's not necessarily a positive notion. It's much more about them. Their first reaction is, well, that's probably about efficiency. It's probably about budget cuts. It's probably about doing more with less. It's more sweat. If you ask people out on the street, they would basically say, I have no idea what productivity is, but it's probably the end of my job. And they're probably not entirely wrong about that, at least not in the short term. We'll come back to that. Some people would say it's really bad because it's the end of, it's really a key issue of climate change and the end of the environment and so on and so forth. So we really need to think about how we're turning that conversation around. And here are some of the words that we are using, and they're really words because we have to bring them to life about why it does matter. So as an economist, I would say productivity is the only source of long-term economic growth. We can't continue to invest in the same stuff. We can only do that if there's new technology coming around. We can't add more and more and more working hours and more people to the workforce. There are limits to that. The only thing that will ultimately drive the economy is productivity, strongly driven by technology and innovation in the broad sense of the word. Productivity frees up resources to invest in new technologies and innovation. Productive firms do grow faster. We know that from research. We also know that productive firms, interestingly, do create more jobs, not less, even though people think that, but more productive firms lead to more job creation. Productive firms mean that people can command higher wages, people become more innovative. Productive people, on the whole, tend to be healthier, and they tend to experience a better quality of life. So that's the stress and burnout concept. Of course, things can go wrong, but at the big picture, this is a positive. And productive places, if you take a sort of regional place-based perspective to it, productive places also produce better outcomes for business and society. So really what we need is different lenses around productivity. So on the left-hand side of this chart, you've got sort of the economic definition, right? So that's what you see basically in the newspapers and in the statistics that are being shared. It's a sort of a measure of national output, GDP or something like that. divided by the number of people in the economy or the number of hours worked in the economy. That's the measure you mostly see, but the measure we find very difficult to make ourselves familiar with when we take it to a business or a place-based level. So you need to have these two different lenses. One is the place-based level, which is if you go from the national economy to place-based kind of environment, it's not so much about the GDP in that small economy, a town or a city or a province, but it's much more about what is the level of well-being, the living standards of the population living there, over the amount of resources we have to put in to create those better living standards. And if you take a business perspective, we'll come back to that a little later, there is not a single definition. Most businesses don't have productivity as their key performance indicator. They do have some metrics around productivity. Obviously, they measure efficiency of particular product lines when you're manufacturing, or some service propositions that you're providing. You can measure the productivity by which those are being provided. But quite often, the firm as a whole, the board is not sitting around the table and say, let's see how well we did this year on productivity. And that's an important issue around why this is a little bit of a fuzzy concept when it comes to these various perspectives. But it does matter if at the end of the day you broaden this definition from the economy decision to a somewhat wider one, which is that productivity is basically about how you optimally use your resources to get better outcomes for people, for firms, and the economy. So your resources are your people, there are your machines and your equipment, your technology, your intangible assets, which we'll come back to a little bit later as well. They're all limited. There's only so much you can have of them. They're all scarce, as we economists are saying. And to combine them optimally in order to create better outcomes for your business, for people in society and the economy as a whole, that's essentially what productivity is about. So if you take the broader definition, it actually becomes relevant for everyone. And you begin to think about how can I now really get my arms around it to bring this concept to life and make it work in practicality. And of course, then today in this talk, I'm not going to talk a lot about the economy. I'll talk a little bit about it. I'm not going to talk at all about the region and place-based perspective, although at the Productivity Institute, we do a lot of work around that because it's really, really important. But I'll spend most of the time on the business perspective on these kind of issues. So let's start then, though, with the economy, because the challenge is, of course, the tension is that most of you in your business are saying, well, even though we don't exactly have productivity as a key performance indicator, I can tell you that we are working on it like hell. I mean, we really work on improving our business performance day by day, and we're having a huge amount of opportunities with technology, with innovations, with investments that we are making. And we're really puzzled why this doesn't turn up in these sort of macroeconomic numbers. What is going on here that there is this productivity challenge that doesn't translate itself up to the level of the economy as a whole? Slow productivity growth is a very widespread phenomenon. This again is the economic measure. So this is GDP per hour, comparable across countries. This is just in US dollars. It's basically what you see. So you see some countries at the top here, which are France and the United States and Germany. They sort of at the top end of the productivity distribution. Then this gray line is sort of the average of the euro area. Of course, also lower productive economies in the euro area. The red line is the United Kingdom, which is right below the euro area average, which of course is a concern because the UK compares itself with countries like Germany and France, but actually finds itself below that European average. And that's why I'm sitting here, because this Productivity Institute is meant to actually see, well, how did this gap arise and what actually happened there? But then we're still doing slightly better in the UK than Spain and Italy. So wide distribution, but the point is that everyone has slowed down. Slow productivity growth in itself is a problem, because we already said why it's so important, but also low productivity levels, which is what you're looking at here. The lower your level becomes, the more challenging it becomes for, particularly on a place-based perspective, because this is a national average. But you take Germany, for example, good example, is at a higher end, but we'll also note that the distribution of productivity between lender within Germany is actually quite large. And there are some lender in Germany where the productivity level is so low that we really have to worry about it from a perspective of living standards and well-being, and also the political implications of some of that we have been seeing even in recent weeks. So productivity is important for growth, but it's also important in terms of levels. And if you have slow growth for a long time, that gradually your levels become really unsustainable. And that's really why this does matter. Now, we don't have the time to go through all the explanations for the productivity slowdown. So this slide just, I quickly run you through this, but I did put on top the measurement issue, because quite often what we find in meetings and in conversations is that people say, we're probably not measuring this. Look, we're living in productivity feels like it's something about the amount of products that we produce, manufactured products, whether it's chairs or machines or whatever, per hour worked or per machine hour. But we're in an economy that consists largely of services. We're in an economy that consists largely out of intangible capital, research and development, organizational capital, and all those kind of human capital. So we really can't measure this very well. And that's a fair point. We as economists do spend a lot of time on improving those measures. The national statistical offices do spend a lot of time on improving these measures, but it is true that we may be understating the growth rate of the productivity somewhat. But it's also very clear from all the work that has been done around this that that is not the whole story. So it's very important to realize that yes, there are big measurement challenges. People are working very hard on that. I think they're getting better every time. But the productivity slowdown cannot be explained away by measurement issues. So we have an issue that we need to really get our arms around. The estimates differ a little bit, but I think on average, most economists would say that maybe 20-25% of the productivity slowdown has a measurement issue around it, but there's still at least a very large chunk that we need to understand. So what are these other factors that could play a role in explaining the productivity slowdown? Well, we had the global financial crisis, we had the pandemic, we had supply chain disruptions following that, stagflation, political uncertainty. All these things can play a role in getting that sort of longer term slowdown. We could have longer supply side issues like slower global growth, China slowing down. We have an aging population, which creates questions about, is the people we have in work, are they sufficiently productive to deal with the rest of the population? We also have demand side issues. As I said, we're living in a services economy, but services on the whole tend to have somewhat slower productivity growth, certainly sort of more personal services and public services. They do have productivity growth, but probably not as fast and as rapid as some industries in manufacturing or business services do. We also have policies, and we started with the Draghi report. Policies can help, but policies can also stand in the way. We can have regulations which are the wrong regulations to be productive. We can have a counterproductive taxing environment. We can have competition rules that don't help productivity growth. And of course, we can have a lot of mess up at the global level with lack of good trade agreements, lack of good international investment agreements, and so on and so forth. And then there are, of course, big transformational challenges like the climate crisis, the change to net zero transition, the inequality in society. I already mentioned the aging. But the one that I really think I will spend a lot of time on today is this question about this technology issue. We do have this massive amount of technology around. We do a lot of work around it, but somehow we don't see it translated into faster productivity growth. And one hypothesis is that it has to do with the fact that the diffusion and the adoption of these new technologies is actually pretty hard. That partly, and because it is pretty hard, we have a limited number of firms that really are doing very well on this. So there's kind of a bit of a winner takes all kind of effect. And that other firms struggle more to catch up with those leaders. And I'll show you some charts in a minute why that might possibly be. But there could be an optimistic side to this and say, that's just a matter of time. And if we can shorten the amount of time by which the technologies diffuse themselves across the economy, we may perhaps be able to see good prospects in terms of productivity ahead of ourselves. So this is really something that we're going to spend a bit more time on later on in this conversation when we talk about technology. Now, just to drive this point home before we move on to the specific issues around how we are thinking about the business aspects of this. This is a very busy chart, but it does show that the blue line is simply the growth rate of productivity. This is for the United States. But it does show basically that the productivity paradox is not there for the first time. The first time we had a productivity paradox was back in the 1980s. And we had an economist, actually Nobel Prize winner Bob Solow, who at that time said, you can see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And that was partly a measurement problem that got corrected. We weren't able to measure laptops and software very well around that time, and we did better on that later. But it also really had to do with the fact that it took a bit of time before companies were widely adopting these kind of new technologies. We've seen a second paradox sort of in the post-financial crisis period. This was a period where we were making the transition from sort of the internet and PC era to an era of cloud computing and big data and so on. And again, during that period, we actually hadn't seen much of a productivity growth happening in the United States. It then picked up a little bit before the pandemic, but then it sort of started to decline again. And we're now sort of in this phase that we say, well, now we're really sort of in this new era of artificial intelligence. Yeah, we see a little bit of pickup in productivity in the United States, but certainly not in Europe, as Draghi has just showed us yesterday. So are we living in a sort of other period of a paradox? So you could say, look, we've been here before. It happened before. We will recover, and there's a good reason to be optimistic. The reason why I want to put a little bit of question marks around this is the fact that there is one problem that has become particularly large. And that is that the number of firms that are at the frontier on productivity is quite limited, and the number of firms that need to catch up with that frontier really struggle doing this. This is work from the OECD. This is firm level data. The top line in this chart is basically the 10% most productive firms that are there. And then you see different countries there, and you can see that the sort of middle range of productive firms that are at about 40 to 60% of the productivity of the leaders. And then there is a group of the 10% least productive firms, and there are sometimes as much as 70, 80% behind the leader. So there are very large gaps between the productivity frontier and those that are following. And that gap, and that's very important, has become significantly bigger. So this is another chart from the OECD. Now you're looking at the productivity growth rate of the 5% most productive firms and the other 95%. And you can see that gap has hugely increased. So this is the winner takes all effect. There are a limited number of companies, and maybe some of your companies are actually in the group of the 5% most productive firms, but you might also perhaps be somewhere in that 95%, either sort of in the 40 to 60% range or at the lower end of it. So the gap between the winner takes all and the followers has increased. And that seems to be bigger this time than it has been before. And that's interesting because as much as we like to believe that technology spread and diffuse even faster, that may be true, but the adoption of those technologies in business processes may actually be more difficult than it used to be. And that may have to do partly with within firm factors, internal factors. It might partly have to do with competition. If these winner takes all have a lot of market power, it may be difficult for the ones that are following to actually adopt these technologies. That's of course an issue for discussion. This is another way to look at this. This is a number for this is for the UK. This is looking at the growth rate of productivity. And what we basically did here for the UK is that we said, well, let's take the whole period 1998 to 2019. So this pre-pandemic, 20 years. Let's look at the performance of the 10 most productive firms that have the highest productivity levels. The performance of the firms that are sort of between the 5th and the 9th decile, so they're more productive than the average firm, but they're not part of the top 10%, and then the least productive. So the 10 most productive is the blue part, the 5th to 9th decile of very productive but not most productive firms is the orange part, and then the gray part is the 50% least productive firms. So what you see there, not surprisingly, the 50% least productive firms don't contribute a lot to productivity growth. They're not very productive. So even if they grow their productivity, it doesn't add a lot to the aggregate number. The 10% most, they take a very large share, disproportionately large share of the productivity growth. And then there is this 5th to 9th decile in the middle that accounts for a significant but not a majority of growth. But see what happened if you divide the period up between 1999 to 2007, so the first decade, this was before the financial crisis, and the second period, which is 2010 to 2019. The blue part hasn't changed much. The most productive firms, 10% most productive firms, keep contributing as much to productivity growth as they used to. The least productive firms, the 50%, as I said, doesn't matter much, didn't change much. All the slowdown in productivity in the UK is coming from the firms in the 5th to 9th decile. So those, again, are productive firms. They're more productive than the average, than the median, but they don't add as much to the productivity growth as they used to. So that really gets us to this point that we have a diffusion problem. We're doing very well at the top end, but we're not able to get that 5 to 9 decile, where a lot of large firms, a lot of people working in it are really getting these effects. And that really is a major concern. Now, this is for the UK. We're testing this for other countries. Similar pictures, not everywhere exactly the same, but this idea of sort of we're not getting the technologies from the top firms to the firms in the second tier of performance seems to be holding up pretty well across the economy. So, John, let me stop there before I go on in the agenda to talk about, taking a level deeper into business productivity, and see if there's sort of any questions from the group or whether you have any reflections, and gives me a bit of time to take a seat.
Yeah, let me reinforce the point that we do Q&A at the end of the session. But if anybody has any question you want to throw in at this point because it's relevant, by all means, let's make it as interactive as is appropriate. So don't hold back on your questions. I'm going to weave them into the conversation. Bart keeps talking, which he does very well, as you can hear. But I can stop him at any time if I see somebody with a question in the chat, or raise your hand and we can just immediately talk. So please don't think that you need to hold your question until the end. For now, Bart, I mean, every time I listen to you, I learn something new. I don't have any specific points. It's just all very insightful at the macro level. And so I know you'll over time get into, business productivity. That's number 3. So I think for now, let's move in.
That's where we go. So yeah. Derek, here's the next poll question. And I hope we will figure out now what is least and most important. So here, the question to you is, what are the primary factors that you as a firm make you a productivity leader? So how does a firm become a productivity leader? Is that because they invest a lot in new technology? Is it because they create a culture of innovation? So it's not just technology, it's broader than that. It's because they are really investing in their workforce skills. It's because they got strong leadership and management. Is it because they invest on the consumer side in customer value, in brand marketing, sales? Is it because they have a lot of financial resources and therefore they can just, have a lot of firepower? Or is it this winner takes all effect? If you are a winner, you can have dominant market shares, and that makes you a more productive firm. Again, of course, all of them play a role. So try to rank them a little bit from least important to the ones that you think are most important. And Derek, if you can give us a little bit of a view about the color scheme in a minute, that would be really helpful, because then we can also help us to interpret the results a little bit. If you a little bit of time to do this.
Image in the chat, Bart.
Okay.
So Bart, Derek and I communicated while you were talking. You need to look at the dark blue, which is ranked 1. So the one that has the most dark blue, there'll be that's where which will have the most ranked ones.
Okay.
The yellow is ranked 2, and the purple is the least ranked. So where are the blues mostly?
Brand marketing, sales, dominant market share,
leadership and management.
Well, leadership and management, we don't have a lot of dark blue, do we?
Yeah, the ones have even less. Okay, you know what? This thing, at least it makes people think. So I would just go on and
we go on.
And
so John,
let's keep going.
And you know what we'll do is we'll share, Derek, let's analyze these results afterwards, and as a little bonus, we'll share them afterwards.
That's a good idea. I like that.
And
I've noticed that whenever you have more ranking numbers, your color scheme changes. That's why I sent you the new one here. So you have the sort of lighter blue is ranked 1, darker blue 2, then 3 is orange, 4 is green, 5 is yellow, 6 is red, and purple is 7.
All right. We'll share it with all of you. We'll just move on in the meantime.
Let's keep going.
Yeah, just a minute. We do have a question from Paul Swift.
Yeah.
In the chat, are there specific industries in the top 10% and in the 50-90 percentile that have seen biggest slowdown in productivity growth?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, and we'll come back to that a little later when we talk about AI adoption. So typically, of course, tech industries themselves tend to be typically at a higher end because they're basically digital natives. They produce this stuff and use it very extensively and provide all sorts of provisions to this. We also find some large services sectors in the business services sector tend to have some of these leaders here. Some big players in some other services sector, like retail, for example, can be at that higher end. Interestingly, and we'll come back to that a little bit later, manufacturing firms, except the tech producers, don't necessarily always find them in that top 10%. And a lot of that has to do, we'll come back to that a little bit later, but some of the tech adoption has taken a slightly different nature, isn't that much specifically AI related as tends to be the case in services. So yeah, there is a bit of a distribution, but I'll come back to that a little bit later.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you.
Thanks, Estelle. What I'm going to do now is we're going to talk a little bit about the drivers of productivity, and we'll sort of have 5 groups of those. And the Productivity Institute did a nice video around that. It's about 2 minutes, which is on YouTube, but I'll play it for you now. And John, if you can just give me a thumbs up that you can hear and see it, then we can watch that, and we'll come back to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
The most successful and profitable businesses are the most productive. Productivity is a measure of how efficiently a business uses its resources to produce goods or services. Businesses that are more productive are able to produce more output with the same amount of input, which can lead to higher profits and faster growth. But it's not just about the bottom line. These businesses are successful and productive because they have typically innovated, invested in new technology, implemented efficient processes, created a culture of continuous improvement, and have invested in their people and intangibles like brand and data. So, what is the secret of these businesses? They think and act strategically and longer term. This makes them more resilient and helps keep them focused on opportunities to build their business. These successful, productive businesses are focused on the bigger picture, company processes, and alignment across functions such as finance, technology and digital, marketing and communication, human resources, and operations. They are also better managed. They monitor operations by using key performance indicators and targets, and ensure that their workforce is trained not only in technical skills, but hard skills, soft skills, and managerial skills too. Productive, successful firms are also ones that continuously manage and track activities which are known to be key drivers of productivity. These 5 key drivers are access to finance and the value of intangible assets, innovation and the implementation and adoption of digital products, investing in worker skills and well-being, inclusive leadership and management training, marketing and communication. Many companies are already gathering information on productivity-related indicators, like sales revenue, throughput per machine hour, number of minutes per customer call, or return on capital, but only in isolation. Good management of productivity is about bringing together boardroom functions to align the different drivers and metrics of productivity and joining them up strategically to improve an organization's performance. To find out more, read Strategic Productivity for the Leadership Team from the Productivity Institute.
Okay, so that kind of brings a couple of things together for the remainder of this talk. One is the drivers, and the other one is sort of the strategic element around this. This is the last part of what I'll be talking about. But let's spend a little bit more time on the drivers. There were 5 there. And I would like to start with innovation and digital, because I do think, as I've mentioned already a couple of times, technology innovation is the key underlying driver of long-term productivity growth. That obviously is things like research and development and technical change, but the digital transformation process, which is much broader than that, and doesn't certainly happen just in the R&D lab, matters generally. But it's also beyond the firm, the ability for firms to work together, either in the supply chains or on ecosystem type innovation platforms where they share new technologies. We see increasingly that firms sort of collaborate in this kind of technological environment. So that's definitely a key driver. But as the video says, this won't happen unless you really can rely very heavily on the human capital in your firm. That's obviously the skills and the need for training of your workforce. What we also mentioned very specifically, it's also about motivated workers who really are part of this kind of continuous innovation culture that an organization has in order to sort of adopt and apply these technologies. And that does also require a certain amount of agility and a certain amount of adaptability within the organization for people to deal with change as these new technologies get introduced. A lot of this is around management competencies. I think of all the 5, once we get to the conversation, and certainly when we get to the end of our conversation this morning, the management and the leadership elements do come back continuously. Technological change and productivity will not happen unless your leadership is very inclusive and brings people along. It definitely has to have a very strong sort of outcome-focused orientation, and linking back sort of the agility and adaptability. The way to manage flexible teams across an organization is very important to implement these technologies. Finance matters enormously, obviously. Finance can sometimes be a bit of a constraint. Think about where we started with budget cuts and so on. But finance leaders, particularly when they're at the table relatively early on in transformation processes, can be big drivers in terms of managing the cost of these projects strategically and keep the eye focused on the ball in terms of the better outcomes. We already mentioned a couple of times intangible assets, which is a challenge. So here we're talking about everything that goes beyond machinery and equipment and buildings, basically everything that if you drop it and it falls on your toes and it doesn't hurt, it's an intangible. So that is research and development and digital, but also the organizational capital that you have, the managerial capital in your organization, the brand capital, it's all intangibles. And from a finance perspective, much harder to manage because they basically have no underlying collateral. It's quite often difficult to price and cost them properly. And as economies and firms become increasingly intangible, this is a big challenge. And then last but not least, productivity tends to be very supply side driven, like something we do as a firm. But ultimately, this is all going to be about your customer, and investing in your marketing and in your brand and in data analytics in order to understand your customer are increasingly seen as key drivers of productivity. So we do a lot of work around those 5 business drivers. We think that all 5 matter. As I said, we quite often come down when we talk to the business community on the management side of it. But the art of this is for the management side to bring these various key drivers together in this framework. The video already related to, a publication we did about 2 years ago, which we're actually currently updating, Strategic Productivity for the Leadership Team, which has some initial ideas in there. We recently did a joint piece with the conference board that was looking at this very much from the human resources and human capital perspective. That's now been published jointly with the conference board. And it gives a lot of these ideas around these 5 key drivers and how the people perspective particularly is fitting into that. So those I can definitely recommend. And we'll come out with some more pieces around this, including information technology and including the role of finance in the next couple of months when it comes to how we connect these various key drivers. So that's sort of at the core, the business productivity idea. Now, let's go back to the technology and digital part because it's such an important driver. I'm just stopping for a minute to see if there's any more questions, or John, if you have any more reflections. Otherwise, I'll just...
I have no questions. If anybody has a question, throw it out now. Yep. On this part. But that Bart is going to go a bit more deeply into this specific framework. And I have a specific point of passion to make around R&D versus innovation and value creation, but I'll make it at some point later on. I'll let you keep going for now. Yes, no questions are coming in, Bart.
Yeah. So again, I mean, go back to these drivers that all matter, but I think innovation and digital is so important, and it is such a critical issue now around the fact that we're all in the business community trying to get our arms around the latest opportunities for artificial intelligence and robotics and so on, and not seeing these productivity effects at the macro level, that I really want to deep dive a little bit more there. What's going on here and where is this potentially heading? Because this is at the core of the productivity paradox. Now, this is a bit of a challenging chart, but the point that the chart really is going to make is that there is a lot we understand about why companies perform differently in terms of productivity, but also a lot that we don't understand. So what this chart does, this is again work by the OECD. It again puts the most productive firms, comparable to the previous chart I showed, the most productive firms at the top of this chart. And then it puts a medium performer, so the 40 to 60% productivity level, at the bottom of the chart, and it tries to understand the gap. So what's explaining the gap between those two? And about half of that gap we understand, we can get our arms around. There's a big role, about 1/3 of the gap between the lead firms and the follower firms is due to human capital. So this has to do with the skill structure of the organization. It has to do with demographic composition, age, gender, ethnicity can all play a role. It has to do with some firm-specific measures like, how large is the engagement of management in the leadership of the organization, diversity of tasks, and so on. So it's a lot of human capital factors that do account for some of the productivity performance, some of the productivity differences, and really points at the role of skills and management in the previous diagram that I showed you. Of course, there's a role for capital. Firms need to invest in machinery and equipment. They need to invest in technological and digital assets. And we do see, so in the UK, for example, we know that a big problem for that gap that I showed earlier between France and Germany and the US and the UK is because UK firms have underinvested for a very significant amount of time, and that does count. But the other 50% is somewhat idiosyncratic. They're kind of firm-specific characteristics. Some of that has to do with organizational capital. So it's about how have firms invested in the structure of their organization, and have they made changes to their organization in order to adapt to new market circumstances or new technological opportunities. Have they invested in brand and design? Again, as I mentioned already a couple of times, the demand side becomes increasingly important. And with new technologies, you have greater and greater opportunity to understand customers and create value for them in a very tailored way. And then there are culture factors, and particular sort of a learning environment and an innovation environment that is continuous, that creates a mindset in the organization that we are actually continuously innovating and learning, rather than do a project and then do something do nothing for a while and then do the next project. So an ad hoc kind of approach to innovation. That the difference between continuous and ad hoc seems to be playing a very large role as well. So it's important to focus on these idiosyncratic factors, and I think that might help us to explain why some countries are very successful in adopting new technologies and others don't.
Bart?
Yeah.
Balázs is asking if you can go and elaborate a bit more on the strategic cost management. Is there anything that you can add to get more definition in that part?
Which was, I think, right here on the top left side as one of the key drivers of access to finance. Yes, I can elaborate a little bit more on that. And I think I mentioned, but I'll try to say a little bit more about it. When we talk to finance leaders and we say, well, sometimes your role can sometimes be difficult when it comes to investments in new projects, particularly if these projects are risky, if they include a lot of intangible assets, if there's a lot of uncertainty because they're new technology, so we don't quite know what the effect of that will be on our return in the small and medium term. Quite often those finance leaders are telling us one of the reasons we are not successful is because we don't get involved early on in the design stage of this kind of work. We basically get involved when the idea has been developed, when there's a kind of a proposition, and then we go to the finance leader and say, we need so many millions in order to actually implement this kind of initiative. But by that time, they actually are already the finance leader is already sort of in a catching up game in order to say, how are we going to sort of deal with this? They're sort of trying to get all the numbers right and fill the spreadsheets out properly, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a very sort of ad hoc kind of involvement. So finance leaders typically would want to be involved early on, so that they become strategically involved in managing the cost and the return of a project like this. But also once the project is happening, it's important for finance leaders to match the short-term needs in terms of the quarterly accounts and the annual accounts with the longer-term cost and returns that these kind of projects are providing. So those are elements of strategic cost management that finance leaders really care about, and that we know can help to get projects that have potentially big productivity gains off the ground. It can also help to steer projects a little bit along the way, because once you get into these projects, there will be new financial uncertainties, and finance leaders can play a big role in making these things happen.
It's interesting. I have two test cases here of things that can go bad or can go wrong, bad or good. When often the CFO becomes a CEO, right? And you have two different types of CFOs that are ready for that because they really have been looking at the business holistically, and they're ready to become an overall business leader, but sometimes not. And there is the Lego case, which I use in my teaching, where at some point Lego was in deep trouble, and they brought in Plowman, who was the CFO, and they promoted him to CEO, but he wasn't ready. So he started for 1 year to cost cut like crazy, and the company only went down even further. And so I use it as an example. And then Knoestorp comes in. And Knoestorp was a McKinsey guy, had been looking at the Lego company already for several years, and he understood the business, and he led that transformation back to glory, frankly. And now they are obviously doing awesome. And then there's the P&G example, which is close to my heart, with John Mueller, CFO for many years, and he became the CEO recently. And I just had a conversation yesterday with somebody like, how is John doing in that role? Is he indeed, doing as CEO? And everybody goes like, yeah. I mean, he's been ready to become a CEO for so many years because he's been trained to be looking at the business holistically. He was always present in the innovation reviews that we had, asking the right business questions, not the right finance questions. So this is such an important area in my view.
Yeah, and I won't take the credit for John Muller's performance at P&G, but I've known him at the time that P&G was and hopefully still is a very active member in the conference board. And at that time, when he was CFO, he would always be incredibly engaged on these topics around productivity, innovation, and growth, far beyond the finance function. So I think you're exactly right in pointing that out, that sort of attitude of finance leaders makes them really strong leaders. But even if they don't get to the CEO position, just their ability to engage is very important. But again, it has to come from both sides. We've been doing some work in the Productivity Institute, and the author of that, Nina Jordan, is on this call, where we've been looking at information and technology leaders. And again, then seeing that they also need to really reach out to other functions in the organization, notably finance, in order to get their projects off the ground. So that, and we'll come back to that at the end of this conversation, because that's what strategic productivity really is about, is bringing the different functions in the organizations together and align them, because they're not necessarily always complementarity. You can't assume that the intentions on productivity improvements from these different functions in the organization are necessarily aligned. So that's why this is really important.
Since we're on this topic, and sometimes stories help, right? And I joined one of the P&G alumni calls recently where John presented, and this was like 2 years ago, I think. And when I was at P&G, I always listen to these things, and you hear the same thing all the time, so you don't really listen anymore at some point. This one, I really listened from an outsider. I go like, let me now from my strategy angle, let me really listen to what he's really saying. And he said something really profound, which is getting into your area here, which is, when he became CEO, he did an analysis to look at the company performance when we focus on top line, and when we focus on bottom line. And he did a comparison between those two eras, right? Or time spans, if you want. And he found that we didn't meet our shareholder requirements in either of the cases. So the conclusion is very simple. We need to do both. So P&G indeed adopted this. We need to drive top line behind our innovation, as you put down this so nicely in the slide, investing obviously in our people to go and get this done. And at the same time, continue to drive your costs down, drive that efficiency, which I think is a nice illustration of this integrated productivity that you're talking about here, right?
And go back to the definition, turning your resources into better outcomes. So better outcomes is top line in this kind of context. The management of resources and the way you combine them, that will ultimately determine how big your bottom line is ultimately going to be. So that's exactly why productivity is right sitting in the middle of it, even though we don't necessarily define that as a key performance indicator in the organization.
Cool, back to you.
Okay, here is a bit sorry for the bit of economics here. Sometimes I betray my background as an economist. I've probably already done that. But economists like to think in terms of production function. So they say resources, to our definition, is labor and capital and technology. And then the outcome is basically the value of products and services. A key issue with artificial intelligence more generally, we'll deep dive a little bit into different types of artificial intelligence just in a minute. But the key issue is that the production function of AI-driven organizations has completely changed. Of course, skills and human capital and labor matters enormously, but it goes deeply together with the role of software and very importantly with the role of data. Those are all intangible capitals. Think of that definition, right? Skills, software, data, they are critical to any kind of productivity results from your organization, but it's all intangibles. There is a tangible, that's computing power, that's AI infrastructure, chips, and everything else. But where in the past, tangible capital might have been accounting for 30–40% of the organization, today, particularly with the prices of computing power going down very rapidly, this is actually a relatively small part of your investment. So skills and software really matter enormously. But then when you look at the outputs as well, it becomes a very different way of thinking about your outputs, right? I mean, they're much more today about sort of analytical tasks like prediction, the ability to provide recommendations or optimization of particular processes, content generation, physical tasks that, of course, are somewhat related to robotics and so on. So we think that one of the reasons that we're struggling a little bit with this adjustment to AI and get productivity from it is that the way that companies are combining their resources and the type of outcomes they're producing is very different, a very different mindset from what it was before. And again, some leading organizations have already made the transition. And as I said earlier, I think some of you definitely will have. But I think a lot of organizations, sort of that middle segment of the productivity performance, are still making that adjustment. And again, finance matters a lot here because, if everything is intangibles, a lot of these organizations, you can rely on your own capital, on your own investors, it's fine. But if you have to go to the bank and get money for these kind of activities, it can actually be pretty hard because the bank would say, where's the collateral for this kind of investment in all these intangibles that you are making? So this is some of the challenges that some of these firms in this middle range are facing, is that they just can't access the capital and the finance in order to make these changes. So having said all that, there are, of course, massive opportunities with AI, but it is interesting to make a distinction between sort of pre-generative AI and the more recent generative AI type of activities, right? So pre-generative AI, obviously related to sort of primarily sort of relying on algorithms, on internal machine learning data sets and machine learning techniques that you're applying. These are very specific use cases, again, from work at the OECD. What they generally tend to show is that the return, the size of the firm level productivity gains of these pre-generative AI use cases is about 10%. And that's not bad, that's good, but it's not very different from digital projects in previous eras. So when you look at that, you say that works. There's definitely a new step in digital technology. Firms that have good data, firms that are really able to apply these machine learning techniques that will do very well, those projects, you should definitely do them. But it's not going to change the needle on productivity growth a lot compared to where we were before. When you look at generative AI, which has much wider applications, much more open AI applications, much easier to access to many firms, and you see a lot of applications there in a wide range of processes that firms are undertaking. There, the use cases are showing significantly larger effects, 20 to 50%. That's quite high compared to previous elements. And if we would all believe that firms could quickly move to generative AI applications and really embed them into their production process and their business processes, we would have to see a significant uptick in terms of productivity growth. So the question really is, how quickly are we actually moving towards the generative AI adoption across firms? And here we see some really interesting evidence. So here's some interesting evidence. They're both McKinsey studies. McKinsey does a lot of interesting work around this, but the first chart here is a somewhat sort of broad definition of AI. In this study, it's not very well defined. It's a global study. It's basically asking, have you adopted AI in at least one business function without being very specific what it is. As I said, a global firm, to a large extent, many sort of very large corporates that were doing this, but the definition of AI wasn't made all that clear. You get very positive results. So overall adoption, the respondents here would say 72% of them would say we are applying AI at least into one business function. And when you look at the use of generative AI, it really ramped up just in the last year from something like 1/3 were saying that they were applying it to 2/3 that were saying they were applying it. So this looks like a really fast adoption curve. And the optimists would love to show this and say, look at how big this is going to be. Now, McKinsey did another study. This was specifically on the UK, but I think, again, it applies more widely, but it's much more specific. It's a representative survey of, so it's not looking only large firms, but it's also looking at the smaller firms. It's properly weighted. The definition of AI is very sharp. It basically says which of the following artificial intelligence do your business currently use? Are you using autonomous vehicles? Are you using data processing or image processing or robotics or text generation or visual content creation? And do you really adopt this? Have you adopted it? So not a sort of accidental adoption, like, I use a search engine on Google, but I really sort of deliberately have invested in this. You now see that the numbers are much smaller, about 15%, 15% of UK businesses say they were using AI technology, and 10% said that were adopted to do that soon. So this is a huge difference, right? Previous chart, 72%, 2/3 to 3/4 said we were doing it. This chart says it's only about 10 to 15%, right? And this is really important. Neither of them is probably wrong, but it just shows what a difference it makes, how precise you are about what you're doing and how determined and focused an application of these new technologies has to be. CEOs, business leaders may just think, oh, opportunities are great. I'm sure somewhere, I've heard people talking about this. Well, we're probably doing this. Here, you're very specifically asking managers who know what we're actually applying and implementing in business processes. What is happening here? Now, a little bit on the distribution to the earlier questions. Of course, you see more adoption in information and communication technology sectors. Interestingly, also in education, some professional services, as I said, business services really matter. But when you look at manufacturing, that actually is sitting below the average here. And again, that might have been because some of the AI applications are actually not very deliberate. They're kind of sitting into the investment in the machinery that these manufacturing firms are making, but are not necessarily seen as a separate sort of AI-specific type of activity. But I think, so it's not quite clear at the moment how steep that adoption curve really is going to be. Now, as I said before, this might just be a matter of time. And there is some good reason to, when you think about resources and outcomes, that it might be very well the case when you adopt new technologies that in first instance you put more resources into it, and the outcomes are only going to get later. And that's what you're basically seeing in this chart, and some of this has been tested as well by economists, that basically show this kind of skewed measurement of productivity growth, that in first instance we understate the potential because we're putting more capital and labor into these intangible technology gains. And later on, maybe we are actually overstating the productivity gain a little bit because the outcomes are actually coming on later, whereas we would have to recognize them over time. So it could just be a matter of time. Some of this, again, is measurement. Not all of this is measurement, but some of it is real in terms of businesses first having to put in the resources, having to access the finance, have to put in the time in order to make these things happening before you're going to see the outcomes happening. And sometimes that can be not just months, it can be years. So even a use case, as I showed earlier, you may be able to deliver in a few months, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your organization as a whole is suddenly become a lot more productive, because that will only happen if that use case is translating itself into other business applications across your organization. So that's basically a way to resolve this productivity paradox a little bit in terms of going forward. Now, what is the size of the prize here? And again, McKinsey did a little bit of interest. This is very hypothetical, but it's kind of an interesting exercise what I did, because they looked at the size of the prize, by which I mean the growth of productivity for the economy and the potential, the impact that it might have on employment in the economy really depends on two factors. One is the speed of adoption. So this is basically the question about how quickly can we apply AI technology to automate tasks that are currently done by manual workers or by manual hours. And there's a sort of fast adoption scenario, this is for the European Union, that is that about 27% of tasks could be fully automated in terms of worker hours. That will be a high adoption scenario versus 2% of tasks that will be very little in terms of what you can really automate. So that's one dimension. How quickly can you automate tasks within your company? And the other factor is how quickly, how effective can you redeploy those hours worked elsewhere in your company in order to really create better outcomes, right? Because what are you going to do with that free up resource? Are we going to not, this is, by the way, this is macro, this is not within the firm, so people can lose their job in one firm, but if they then get re-employed by another firm that actually needs those people, you might have seen positive productivity effects. So at a very positive scenario, you could see productivity growth in this top right corner go up to something like 3.1% and without any additional unemployment. That would be a really very good scenario if it would go there, right? If in a couple of years' time we could say, look, we're raising productivity growth from pretty much 1% today to 3% now, which is a huge productivity gain, and we are not doing that at the cost of creating a lot more unemployment, would be a fantastic outcome. But if you go at the lower end of it and you say the adoption will be low and we're actually not able to redeploy all these people, the gain may be pretty much zero, maybe 0.2%, not a lot more than that. And we will actually raise unemployment by about 0.9%, 0.9 million people. Again, this is just scenario thinking. This is not a forecast, but it just shows how big the uncertainty is between the various outcomes. Now, this is macro, so why do we care? Well, we have to care because it really shows that we need to understand the implications of what automating technologies means and how this is driving business and employee value. We need to understand what this means for the future of work potential. Where are the workers and where are the hours, the tasks that we need for specific hours? We need to think strategically about our workforce because these people may leave, but there are other people we need. And we obviously need to put a lot of emphasis, going back to our business drivers, on skill development and on managerial competencies. So lots of uncertainty here about the size of the prize, potentially very large. But if we don't do this very well, if we're not able to properly automate and redeploy workers in the economy, then we may not be seeing all that much. And that's why we have so much uncertainty around this.
Let's go to what it means for leaders, Bart, so that we have a bit of time for Q&A at the end.
Yes, that's right. So I think I'm about ready to go there. Here, very quick summary here. Is this time different? As I said, the productivity paradox may be simply there because inputs will come before outputs and time will proceed. But that's not the whole story. Every technology looks different, and AI technology definitely looks different from previous technologies. And we really need to think about our production function. I haven't had time to talk about the whole issue of compute power and energy usage around that. That is a big challenge that we need to resolve. And I don't have time to talk about responsible AI because we all know that artificial intelligence has some risks with it around security and safety and privacy. And organizations need to work very hard with government to really fully understand those. And we're not really very far down the road in doing that. But as you said, John, let's go to the last section and really say, okay, now that we know all this, so we know we have these 5 business drivers, we know that technology is incredibly important. How do we, in all this environment of uncertainty, make it happen that at least as a business, we can really catch up with this? Now, I was going to do another poll, but part of the question, I'm probably not going to do this poll now. I'm going to go straight to the question around, well, let me stay with the poll for a moment, but not run it. But basically say, there's some reasons why businesses really need to think about how can we be more productive. One is that we need a clearer narrative around why it matters. As I said, productivity isn't necessarily a top key performance indicator. So if you think it has to play a role in your organization, you need to have a story around it. And I've been trying to tell that story from a couple of different perspectives. We quite often find, particularly with smaller companies, but also with larger companies, productivity needs time. It needs thinking time. And quite often organizations don't allow themselves the thinking time to identify these productivity opportunities. That's particularly true for small and medium-sized business. It's actually the key issue for small and medium-sized business that they just don't have the thinking time. But even in large organizations, we may sometimes be running from one reorganization to the next and whatever else we are doing without giving us the time to think strategically about these long-term effects. We need to have much better process to assess the productivity initiatives, because there's lots of opportunities, small and big, and we need to really think about how we prioritize these various initiatives, because we can't do everything at the same time. So how can we get to a sort of systematic prioritization of productivity initiatives? I mentioned the word agility already a couple of times. New technologies, productivity growth means lots of changes in the organization, and we need to have an agile workforce to deal with these changes. And that doesn't come to you automatically. It's a culture in which people are willing to work across organization teams, in flexible teams, and so on. And it doesn't come automatically. It's risky, and therefore organization needs to have some resilience, both in sort of tangible terms, in terms of the financial backup of that, but also in terms of its culture of being able to deal with the uncertainties. And you need, of course, better ways to measure the productivity impacts, which I already mentioned. So what is strategic productivity really about? It really is about the fact that you can't have it in one place in the organization. It's not like in the past where research and development was done in the productivity lab, and then once we had the invention, then we were rolling it out in the organization. Productivity happens everywhere. It happens obviously at the operational part of the organization, whether it's technology or other parts of the operational function in the organization. The human capital and employee component is hugely important. And as I said over and over again, don't forget about the customer. Productivity is not just supply side, it's the demand side and the ability to understand the customer and deliver better value that really matters. These narratives are quite different across these organizations. When you hear an HR leader talk about productivity, he, she will talk very differently about it than somebody at the operational end, somebody at the finance end, or somebody at the marketing end. That's fine. But we need to get these productivity narratives together. And much more importantly, we need to understand how they can sort of build on each other in order to be able to really deliver better results. So here are some insights that I think are from our research that are important. Productivity can be difficult to manage because it does involve so many different parts of the organization. And the risk is that you make everybody responsible and nobody is. And that's, of course, something that's, I think, perhaps quite often one of the reasons that productivity doesn't get a good place in an organization, because we don't know whose responsibility this is. So it is important that we do embrace all these key drivers, but the responsibilities for different parts of the drivers have to be shared at the functional level. Obviously, the people at the people end of the organization will take a much larger responsibility for the skills and for the managerial part of it, whereas people at the operational side will take much more care of the whole digital side of it or the finance side of it. But they need to really, so these different responsibilities are together, but we ultimately need to collaborate to align a long-term strategy that needs to be fit in with medium-term plans and short-term tactics. There are trade-offs. Productivity is definitely creating trade-offs in terms of if we are going to invest in the longer term, it means that there are perhaps some short-term things that we cannot be doing that might give us quick returns and quick gains, but don't give us the longer-term gains. Investing in employee engagement is great, but it can take some time before it's actually pulling off effects. Investing in digital can only happen if it is complementary to the skills and the management competencies in the organization, and so on and so forth. So you need to really think in a leadership team around how you tackle these trade-offs and how you capture the complementarities of these productivity improving projects. Prioritization is very important. I'm not going to spend time on this, but I'm a strong believer in something that's called the fear of constraints. It's basically kind of saying, look, you can't solve everything at once. You have, as an organization, if you work together on these projects, you have to find what your biggest gains are, and then begin to prioritize those, which means that you have to deprioritize other things that you're doing, collaborate on it, and then you start again with the next big opportunity that you have. So systematic prioritization is really important, and again, requires some real analytical space to do this. So John, this is where I'm going to stop, I think. Again, I think this is the core part of it, is how do we make sure that productivity, these various aspects of productivity, get a place across the organization, and how do we bring it together in cross collaboration in the leadership team of the organization, because that ultimately is what strategic productivity is about, and that hopefully will bring more firms that are not in that winner group to that winner group so that we can get much more broad-based effects of that, and we will see that sort of paradox between firm productivity performance and the aggregate economy performance gradually being resolved.
Excellent. Thank you, Bart. It was, as always, very insightful.